The world remembers a finished performance. The spotlight, the scream of the crowd, the single glove catching the light for half a second before disappearing into a spin. What the world rarely saw was the empty room that came before it. No audience, no pyrotechnics, no wardrobe. Just a mirror, a boombox, and a man who treated every step like it had to be earned twice. Once in private, and only then in public. This is the story that lives behind the finished product. The discipline, the repetition, and the quiet obsession that turned performer into a legend. Long before any tour was announced, before any album dropped, there was a routine that almost nobody outside a small circle of choreographers and dancers ever witnessed. Rehearsal spaces were often rented out for entire nights, not because a show demanded it, but because a single routine needed to be broken down into its smallest components. The placement of a heel, the tilt of a shoulder, the exact count on which a freeze should land. Choreographers who worked alongside him over the decades have described a performer who was never satisfied with good enough. Someone who would run a 16-count phrase dozens of times in a row until the movement stopped looking like choreography and started looking like instinct. This obsession with repetition wasn't about vanity. It came from a belief that an audience could feel the difference between a move that had been drilled into muscle memory and one that was merely performed from memory. When a routine finally hit the stage, it needed to look like it required no effort at all, which meant that behind the scenes, an enormous amount of effort had already been spent making it disappear. Few tracks demonstrate that hidden labor better than the horror-tinged centerpiece of the Thriller album. On paper, the pitch sounds almost reckless. Take a dance record and fuse it with the tone of a late-night horror film, complete with eerie synthesizer textures, unsettling sound design, and a spoken monologue that sounds like it wandered in from a different genre entirely. It could easily have collapsed under its own ambition. Instead, it became one of the most replayed short films in music history. The choreography for the accompanying film leaned into that horror concept rather than shying away from it, mixing traditional dance vocabulary with exaggerated, undead physicality. Stiff-jointed group formations, sudden lurches, and synchronized ensemble work that turned an entire graveyard into a single moving body. Rehearsing that kind of full-cast choreography required more than personal discipline. It required teaching an ensemble of dancers to move as one unit, on one count, without losing the theatrical menace the concept demanded. Extended rehearsal footage from that period, when it has surfaced publicly over the years, shows a director's level of attentiveness to blocking, where each dancer stands when they turn, how far they travel, layered directly on top of the choreography itself. Not every iconic routine started in a rehearsal studio. Some started somewhere far more mundane. According to accounts from those close to the creative process, the foundation, one of the most recognizable bass lines in pop music history, arrived almost by accident, taking shape in a performer's head during an ordinary car ride through the city. Once that rhythm locked in, it apparently refused to leave, and what eventually grew around it became a tense, moody narrative about obsession and unwanted attention. Themes that, by that point in his career, weren't exactly hypothetical. The song's most famous live rendition wasn't even born on a concert stage. It happened on a television special celebrating decades of a record label's history, in front of a room full of industry legends rather than a stadium crowd. What audiences saw that night looked spontaneous, almost like a performer simply letting the music move him. What actually preceded it was the opposite of spontaneous, an extended stretch of private rehearsal in which every glide, spin, and freeze was tested, adjusted, and tested again until the sequence could survive a single unrepeatable live take. Interestingly, by most accounts, the performer walked offstage that night not entirely satisfied with his own execution, fixated on one landing that didn't feel as clean as it had in rehearsal. It reportedly took a congratulatory phone call from one of the most celebrated dancers of an earlier generation to convince him performance had landed exactly the way it needed to. That same televised performance also introduced the world to a piece of choreography that would outlive nearly every other dance move of its era. For a few seconds, it genuinely looked like the laws of physics had been suspended, a forward-leaning glide that somehow carried the body backward across the floor, smooth and continuous, with no visible break in the illusion. The trick wasn't magic. It was mechanics, built on very precise weight transfer and heel-to-toe timing that had to be rehearsed until it became automatic. The move itself wasn't invented from nothing. It drew on techniques that had been circulating for years in underground street and funk dance styles, refined by dancers who rarely received mainstream recognition for their innovation. What set this version apart was the discipline behind its execution. Countless private repetitions until an obviously physical technique started to look genuinely otherworldly. Once introduced to a global television audience, the move didn't just become a signature step. It became a cultural shorthand, endlessly imitated, taught in dance studios, and referenced in performances that had nothing to do with the original artist at all. By the mid-1990s, a music video budget had ballooned into something closer to a short film production, complete with nearly feature-length runtime, elaborate set design, and a horror-adjacent storyline built almost entirely around movement as a form of dramatic tension. Unlike earlier supernatural-themed projects in the same catalog, this one placed dance at the absolute center of its horror rather than treating it as a stylistic flourish. The choreography for this project shifted noticeably darker and heavier than what audiences had grown used to. Sharp stomps replaced lighter footwork, aggressive sweeping arm movements and rapid spins carried more weight and tension, and even small gestures were performed with intensity that suggested defiance rather than entertainment. Every sequence pushed into territory that felt genuinely unfamiliar for the artist's catalog at that point. The film's most technically ambitious sequence involved translating live-captured human movement onto a fully animated skeletal character using early motion capture technology, an approach that was still relatively novel for a mainstream music video at the time. The result allowed for a level of physical impossibility no human performer could achieve alone, while still preserving the exact rhythm and phrasing of the original choreography underneath it. Few illusions in performance history have generated as much genuine confusion as a forward-leaning tilt performed during a moody, suspense-driven track from the same era. Audiences who witnessed it live were left staring in disbelief. There were no visible support beams, no ropes, nothing that explained how a human body could lean that far forward from the ankles without simply falling. In the original film version, the effect relied on hidden support rigging built directly into the set. But translating that illusion into a touring stage show required an entirely different solution, and the one eventually engineered involved a specially modified shoe with a heel slot that could lock into anchor points embedded in the stage floor at precisely the right moment. Even with that hardware working exactly as designed, the illusion still demanded extraordinary core strength, balance, and timing from the performer. Technology alone wasn't enough to sell it. Rehearsing that lean wasn't just about learning the mechanism. It was about learning to trust it completely, to commit body weight forward with total confidence that the anchor would catch it in time. Decades later, it remains one of the more remarkable fusions of stage engineering and raw physical performance in modern concert history. Perhaps the most quietly devastating chapter in this story involves production that never opened. In the final months of his life, an ambitious concert residency was an act of preparation. New arrangements of classic material, elaborate visual staging, and a level of production ambition meant to mark a full-scale return to live performance after years away from major touring. Behind the scenes, rehearsal footage from this period captured something the production team never originally intended to release. Cameras were rolling purely for internal reference purposes, documenting blocking, checking camera angles, making sure lighting cues matched choreography, not for any kind of public film. But after his sudden passing before the residency could begin, that raw rehearsal material became something else entirely. An unplanned final record, an artist still chasing precision until the very end. What makes the footage striking isn't spectacle. It's the opposite. It shows someone in his 50s still marking every count, still adjusting formation by a few inches, still treating a rehearsal room the same way he had decades earlier, as a space where nothing was allowed to be less than exact. Not every rehearsal story is about secrecy. Some of the most influential choreography of this catalog was built specifically to be seen, to reshape what a music video could do as a storytelling medium. One standout track from the same album cycle as a horror-themed centerpiece leaned hard into rock instrumentation, anchored by a searing guitar solo, and paired it with a music video that cast real members of rival street gangs rather than professional extras, an unusual and, at the time, fairly daring creative decision that blurred the line between stage performance and real social tension. The choreography built around that track fused sharp, percussive martial precision with raw street energy. Locked elbows, explosive chest hits, sudden freezes, tight spins, and toe stands that required both flexibility and total balance control. Signature gestures, the shoulder shimmies, the pointed fingers, the sudden stillness after a burst of motion, turned individual movements into a kind of visual vocabulary that other artists would spend decades borrowing from. None of that precision happened by accident. Every explosive movement in the finished video was a product of rehearsal sessions built around isolating single gestures until they could be repeated identically, take after take, with zero variation. Dance in this catalog wasn't always about spectacle or seduction. Sometimes it was a vehicle for something considerably angrier. One particularly confrontational track, built on militaristic percussion and chant-like vocal repetition, transformed political frustration into a piece of collective, rhythm-driven protest. The accompanying choreography matched that intensity, trading smooth musicality for something more militant and aggressive. Synchronized group formations that move with an almost combative sharpness, designed to feel less like entertainment and more like a demonstration. Two contrasting music videos extended that message visually, pairing a vibrant, community-centered setting against a starker, more confined environment intercut with real-world footage of violence and social unrest. Rehearsing choreography meant to evoke anger and defiance required a different kind of preparation than rehearsing something meant to charm an audience. Dancers had to find and sustain an emotional register through repetition, not just a physical one, so that by the time cameras rolled, the aggression of the movement read as genuine rather than performed. By the late 1980s, an entirely new performance identity had begun to take shape, one built less on charm and more on control. A title track from that period, co-produced with a longtime collaborator, was inspired by a real story about survival and self-assertion, and the choreography built around it reflected that shift directly. Sharp bass lines and punchy percussion were matched by aggressive, angular movement. Fast footwork, sharp arm hits, tightly controlled spins, and synchronized group formations that projected tension rather than ease. The accompanying short film reimagined a subway confrontation as a full-scale stylized dance battle, blending cinematic staging with street-inspired movement vocabulary. Every gesture in that sequence carried intention. Posture and timing became storytelling tools in their own right, not just visual flourishes layered on top of the music. Rehearsals for a piece like this weren't only about hitting choreography counts correctly. They were about building an entire physical character from scratch, one that had to remain consistent across dozens of takes and eventually hundreds of live performances. Not every rehearsal room was chasing spectacle. One of the more mature entries in this catalog, built around themes of secrecy and hidden desire, deliberately stripped away large-scale group choreography in favor of something far more intimate. Set against a minimal desert backdrop, the accompanying video relied almost entirely on subtle body language, shoulder rolls, restrained footwork, deliberate pauses, to communicate longing and tension without a single dramatic formation. That kind of minimalism is, in some ways, harder to rehearse than a full ensemble routine. There's no elaborate staging to hide behind, no group formation to disguise a slightly mistimed count. Every micro-movement has to be deliberate, because the camera is close enough to catch hesitation. Rehearsing restraint meant rehearsing stillness just as rigorously as movement, learning exactly how long a pause could last before it stopped feeling intentional and started feeling like an accident. Charisma-driven choreography required an entirely different rehearsal philosophy than any of the tightly engineered, high-concept routines described above. One of the most beloved tracks from the same era leaned almost entirely on personality rather than technical spectacle, loose, playful, spontaneous-feeling movement built around finger snaps, quick spins, shoulder pops, and sudden freezes, all filmed in a lived-in street setting rather than a fantastical soundstage. Ironically, that sense of effortless spontaneity is often the hardest thing of all to rehearse convincingly. Choreography built to look improvised still has to be blocked, timed, and repeated until the looseness itself becomes reliable. Dancers and performers alike had to rehearse not just steps, but attitude, finding a version of confidence that could be recreated identically on cue, night after night, without ever looking rehearsed at all. Some of the most striking rehearsal footage that has surfaced over the years documents choreography that never made it fully intact onto broadcast television. A globally massive pop single from the early 1990s carried a bright, catchy melody on the surface, but one extended segment with accompanying film abandoned strict choreography almost entirely in favor of raw, aggressive improvisation, sudden freezes, explosive bursts of speed, and screams that traded polish for pure physical intensity. Private rehearsal footage from this period reportedly shows a noticeably different creative process than the tightly structured routines elsewhere in the catalog, less about counting 8 counts and more about exploring a physical, almost predatory state and finding movement that felt dangerous rather than clean. It's a reminder that not every rehearsal room was chasing perfection in the traditional sense. Some were chasing raw honesty instead, and that pursuit came with its own kind of relentless repetition. Across every era, every genre shift, and every larger-than-life production, one thread connects all of it. None of it happened by accident. The spontaneity audiences felt watching a live performance was manufactured through months of unglamorous, repetitive labor in empty rooms most people never got to witness. Formations were built and rebuilt. Single gestures were rehearsed in isolation until they could be executed identically 100 times in a row. Illusions that looked physically impossible on stage were, underneath the mechanics, simply the product of total commitment paired with total preparation. What made the rehearsal footage that has occasionally leaked or been released over the years so compelling wasn't the absence of glamour. It was the presence of obsession. Watching someone run the same 16 counts for the 40th time, adjusting a single wrist angle by a few degrees, says more about the making of a legend than any finished performance ever could. The stage was where the world watched the results. The rehearsal room was where those results were actually built, one repetition at a time, largely unseen, almost entirely unheard of, until footage like this occasionally pulls back the curtain and lets the rest of us in. The legacy that so many people around the world grew up watching, imitating, and being amazed by wasn't a product of natural talent alone. It was a product of thousands of hours spent in rooms with no audience, chasing a version of perfection that very few performers have ever pursued with the same relentlessness. That, more than any single spin, lean, or glide, may be the most enduring part of the story.